One thing that I've been curious about since I've become aware of William Barber is why he hasn't gained more traction.
Right.
And I've as I've been sitting here and I've been trying to think about the question, I'm wondering if maybe it's because the objectives maybe aren't as concrete as they were like when Martin Luther King was doing his stuff, or maybe because it's the poor people's campaign and poor people are but then again, Martin Luther King was dealing with black people at a time when black people were had no even less respect than they do now. So I've just been curious about why he hasn't
Martin Luther King died.
Yeah.
Martin Luther King died while preparing for a poor people's movement.
Yeah.
They were going to have bringing everything together. Part of the poor people's movement was that they were going to occupy Washington.
Yep.
They were going to build tents in like major parts of Washington and just have
Right. And to that point, the poor people's movement, they were supposed to have an international poor people's rally in DC in June. That's obviously not happening now. I was going to go to but they have spots in all 50 states and something going, but I mean, as far as just media coverage on it, I think that's really where the answer to your question is. It's not as, it is more organized, but it's not as it's not.
Well, I guess my question too is why the media doesn't. I know that he gets talked about a little bit, but it's just like, why doesn't he get more media coverage than he does?
Because the shareholders don't want him to.
You're right. Can you go on that point? I think that's true. It's not a left right thing. I think it's a corporate thing.
Like the thing is if you just, because I've been in protest circuits in and out for years, when the media cares about an issue, you will hear about it nonstop. But if it's actually going to change anything for their bottom line, and their meaning the owners, the shareholders, who are also shareholders in almost every other company in the world, it's not going to happen. I mean, why are we devoting so much time to a couple of cranks running around Michigan during a lockdown? Well, it's because the shareholders are really, really worried about their precarious position here in post-pandemic US. That's why. It's because they want to open up, regardless of the consequences. And when you get that push from corporate sponsorship, you get a lot of free advertisement. Whereas some very popular, I'm talking very popular movements that I was a part of, probably some of you all maybe never heard of it or never even realized it was as big as it was. I, sat down with 15,000 people in Fort Benning, Georgia, so that I could get arrested to stop a school that trains foreign military people in anti-insurgency techniques, which they frequently use against their own people. It was almost never mentioned in the media. I had never heard of this until someone in another human rights circle said, "Hey, you should check this out." And it was all by word of mouth. And, but you never heard about it in the media. And that's how it goes. And what I want to know, though, is if you've ever seen protests in Europe, like, why do our protests never go like they go in Europe? Because in Europe, they are a blend between a riot and a protest. You have giant protests. Like, I saw a video of one because they've started using laser pointers as anti-camera devices so that people won't get spotted by the police. And with all of the tear gas and the lasers and the people yelling, it looks absolutely like these people are ready for war. The
the yellow vests. So when I was in Europe last year, we couldn't get off at certain stops because the yellow vests were there. They're like, oh, you can't. We're not gonna even mess with that. But I don't think that. I don't even know if that's a thing here, not necessarily yellow vest, but if it's to that extent of like, okay, there's going to be a protest here, we're not going to go in this area.
Yeah. And it's like that all over Europe.
Yeah.
Like
when I was
in Europe.
When I was talking about the effectiveness of violence and protesting, Phil, I was waiting for you to mention the yellow vest and Europe. And I do think that there are some cultural differences. I think that that's maybe where you were going, is why are there those cultural differences? But I do think that because I think France has such a history, France particularly, I mean, I know that there are there can be violent protests in other parts, but I've read a lot about French protest history, and there's a lot of violence involved in that country specifically, in a lot of their protests. And I think that part, like, what tactics might be deemed acceptable by the public there might not translate to the types of tactics that
but you even see it in like what we consider like an overly organized country like Germany. Like German protests are nuts. And the whole like, remember in Charlottesville where you saw everybody kind of geared up like they were, Knights of Home Depot? That's straight out of Germany.
Yeah.
But like in Germany, they build literal siege weapons out of shit from Home Depot. And they're running around with their like siege towers and stuff fighting the police.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And it's bizarre to me that you have such a stark contrast, especially when and many people have pointed out, like, sporting events that go out of control, like that's a norm here too, but it's a norm all over the world. They expect that. That's kind of considered, even in very quote unquote orderly countries like Japan. I've seen soccer riots that were pretty cool.
I was
like those people are partying.
I was gonna say, I mean, like, we have rambunctious crowds, but like what we consider rambunctious sports crowds in America, I feel like they would laugh at us in Europe if we said, like, look how rambunctious our crowds are compared to like things that you, like you said, like you see with those soccer riots, or football riots as they would call it. I mean, like, we're downright tame over here. The Oakland Raiders and the Philadelphia Eagles fans.
I was going to say.
I wasn't going to mention it, but
I'm like, they're downright tame compared to what I've seen from some of the football fans over in Europe.
So millennials grew up experiencing mass shootings, Columbine, the Iraq War. I think by the time became of age, war lost so much credibility, pretty much thanks to the Vietnam era, destroying the credibility of war. So is it even in us to be violent like they are in Europe? I mean, can something like that happen? Do we even need that? Do we really want that? Do we have to go to that length for change?
I'm a big proponent of hitting someone today so you don't have to shoot them tomorrow. In a lot of ways. So, and that's one of the things that I kind of find weird about our society, is that we try to completely suppress violence. Whereas, like, in countries where you find like a lot of gun control legislation, a lot of like these like peaceful type of pushes, they have a lot of fistfights.
So you're talking about Punch a Nazi?
Well, Punch a Nazi is a good one, but like,
the things that I don't know, the things that the things I don't know if there's a direct target though. It's almost like the war on terrorism. Like,
Right.
what is that? But like when it comes to like things that we want to fight for, it's like we can't touch it. It's intangible. Right. So how do we?
That's a very.
I don't know.
How do we fight it?
I gotta say that I've always, maybe I'm too Pollyannish, but I've always found the appeal of Martin Luther King's hate can't drive out hate, only love can do that. Darkness can't drive out darkness, only light can do that. So I personally think that, like he said, violence just begets more violence more often than not. And
and I'm not. Yeah. I guess I wasn't saying so much like violence per se, but even when we're targeting things, like how do you can't even find what it is.
Martin Luther King had a very
what it is
defined enemy that he was working against.
Yeah.
I mean, means is one thing, he was definitely working against.
Yeah, it was fighting race. Well,
but who are we?
Segregation.
Who are we fighting? Who's blocking? They're saying that we're millennials is a doomed generation. Who do we have to fight to undo that narrative?
The system.
What is the enemy here?
Well, I mean, in my opinion, it's the politicians and the shareholders, because they're not afraid of us, and that's kind of the big problem, in my opinion.
Well, I also think. Sorry, continue. I was going to say that I also think that it's ideology, because you can stop the shareholders. You can stop them from doing whatever they're doing. But who knows what's already being ingrained in younger generations. So it's like, it's going to keep coming back, like that mentality or that frame of mind. So it's just...
But it's still like progress is progress. Like I like the history of the labor movement a lot, because they didn't necessarily, at the time, most of them did not want to end their bosses. Right? Like a few did. You had like the IWW, they wanted to destroy the wage system. But most labor unions and most labor activists at the time when that was really prominent, they just wanted, an increase in rights, an increase in personal welfare. And they didn't necessarily know what they were fighting either, is the thing. They didn't, because they didn't want to go out and they didn't want to kill their boss, right? They might punch him upside the head. Hey, stop it. They may want to do that, but they don't want to permanently hurt somebody or injure them. They just wanted to apply enough force to make life viable for them.
And I think that, sorry, I was just going to say, really, no, sorry. Yeah.
No.
No, I was just going to say that I think that one of the things, too, is that we were framing it in the sense of who are we fighting against or what are we fighting against, whereas you could frame it the other way of what are you fighting for. And I think that they knew what they were fighting for. They were fighting for a better standard of living, better working conditions, and better treatment. And I think that is, another way of looking at it.
So Darius, yesterday we taped a show with David Kaiser,
right?
Historian David Kaiser, and I don't know if it was me or you who made the point that millennials are pretty much in the same boat that the GI generation was in 19.
Yeah, that was you.
Only thing. Okay, well, thank you, Ryan. And basically, we're in the same boat that we were in, that the GI generation was in around 1940. The same generation that was behind the labor movement.
Well, the labor movement has a very long history.
Right. Well, the 1930s one.
Right.
So basically, we're them without a World War II and a GI Bill to help push us into the next level. Do we need something like that? What is the modern equivalent of a GI Bill? Something to do with college loans or what?
I think we need to end all debt.
I think that would help. I think that would help a lot of people just kind of reset and go, okay, now what do I really value?
Right. Yeah.
But who knows if that'll happen? That'll be great. But as you say, the stakeholders are like, no, we still want our money.
What about universal basic income?
I think that is kind of an inevitable, along with the healthcare. If they're saying that this pandemic's going to last for a year and a half
Yeah, they
more,
need to figure it out.
then you can't have that many people having unreliable income. Like capitalism can't survive that. And that's one of the reasons that I say that a system that can't start and stop shouldn't exist. Like, this is why, is because if all of a sudden you can't stop doing something and you need to, then you're dooming a lot of people.
Yeah, well, and that's what I was saying when you said it was inevitable. It's like it's not necessarily inevitable. It's just hard to see how most working class people survive if it doesn't become inevitable. Because I one of the things that I think about is it's hard. I know that a lot of people will say that in the past, when there's been technological advancements, there's been the same people saying, oh, no one's going to be able to have any jobs now because of the fact that, technology has improved the efficiency of and worker productivity, and it's going to make less workers needed. But then eventually new industries came about that absorbed those. I think one of the differences though now is that AI is getting to a point where they can just do almost anything better than we can. And like at some point we will get to that point where they are just superior and they're not needing us to do stuff, needing us to do things in the way that like a factory became more efficient by having a press, but they still needed humans to operate it. And obviously there'll still be the need for people who work on AI, but it's like I don't know that the analogy is necessarily the same, in that new industries are definitely going to come about that absorb all of us, and we're still going to be able to have 98% employment unless people are working jobs that are just useless pretty much and could be
I think a lot of people are already working jobs that are that are useless and meaningless. And I also
think The Economist had an article about that.
And I also think that what we're talking about is an order of magnitude, because even if AI doesn't get so good that it completely wipes out an industry, if it gets so good that it wipes out everybody in my office but me, like you can shrink things down to where you're talking about the magnitude. You don't have time to make new industries or new jobs, and there's got to be something in the stopgap.
Yeah, and I guess that's what makes me nervous when people see this amount of consolidation of wealth and think that this is going to work out in the long run. It's like they will let you starve to death, like that movie Elysium. Like I was like, this is like the future that we're headed towards if people don't like realize that like what the future could look like. I don't know.
So you're making me think of now the future. So millennials are usually put in a box of the socialist box. Apparently, we're a generation that will bring in socialism, democratic socialism for those who are afraid of just socialism by itself. Are we really a socialistic generation, or is this the end of capitalism? Or are we? Is it just an age thing? Like
it could be the fact that we weren't prepared for what was given to us or what we inherited when we became of age to be adults, and us going, well, this doesn't make sense. Why do we have to fall into this? Like, why do we need X, Y, and Z? This isn't how we were conditioned from the beginning. So like all of a sudden now we need a dead end job in order to pay these bills, which go to this, or pay rent that goes to some other person, or like there's no way to invest money. There's no way to save money for that matter with what we get paid, going back to $10 an hour or $15 an hour. Like there's, you know, we see the issue. So maybe there is something to be said for like going through that thing of like, yeah, socialism doesn't sound so bad. Just to like have like a baseline of just some level of support, because whatever they have going on right now isn't working for everybody.
I think the data seems relatively clear that millennials are more comfortable with the term than past generations have, probably because of the Cold War. But I guess I would. Well, one of my questions has always been though too is, what does that term mean to the people who say that they're comfortable with the term? Because I think it's, especially in the United States, I feel like it's such a nebulous concept to a lot of people that if you use the word socialism, it means a million different things to a million different people. There's like Marxists who actually know the history of socialism. Well, even not even Marxists, because a lot of Marxists don't know that there was socialism before Marxism.
And I was just about to say, like, Marx spent most of his career trash talking capitalism. He didn't really fully define how socialism was supposed to work.
He also spent a lot of his time trash talking other forms of socialism. Like Marxism isn't the only form of socialism that was ever designed. there was a lot of socialists that predated Marx, and Marx spent a lot of time trashing them too. So I think that there's so much confusion about the term, and it doesn't so many different things to so many different people. It's hard to know when millennials say like, yeah, I'm okay with socialism. What does that mean? Like, what are you envisioning when you say that?
Well, I think when I was younger, I remember just hearing like communism or socialism and going like, all right, fine. And then someone else would be like, oh my God, it's communism. And I'm like, wait, so what's the problem with communism? And then they would explain it, and I go, that doesn't sound so bad, guys. Like,
So is it inherently part of? So we're associated with the left. The millennials are leftists. So
some of us.
Is it because? But like, is it generally? Generally speaking, they put us in that box. We're in a lot of boxes. Is it something? Does it go back to the point that most young people think with their hearts and they're leftists, and then as they get old, they start to think about with their brains? That whole like, or is it something that really is part of our DNA?
I mean, in the group, we started to talk about this. I know Mike Alexander, who, of course, in the group, he does a lot of work with like economics and data. Us and David were talking about Thomas Piketty's book, and I don't know, maybe we can do something about that.
Yeah, we should.
Yeah, we definitely should.
Yeah.
You have different outlets calling him the new Marx for the 21st century.
Mm-hmm.
And
which is how he wants to be seen, which is why he titles his books the way he does.
Right. Right. Yeah. And I mean, sort of to that point, like his whole criticism of the way that we currently do capitalism, of course, when inequality reaches a certain point, usually shortly after that, there's some type of revolution. And he talks about in his first book, Capital, how it was between 1914 and 1945, that's the only period in recent history that there was a serious leveling of wealth. And because you had a generation coming off of that, I think for the most part, like boomers, the reason that we go over to sort of that Reagan narrative of capitalism is because they just had the fortune of coming off a period of time where when that leveling happened, the way wealth was distributed throughout society, again, it was more even. When you talked about generating capital, it was they may not have, the average person probably didn't like explicitly think this, but it was generally a sense that when the economy was doing good, you would do good.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, these two Atlantic articles we mentioned in the beginning here, it's pretty much about the decoupling between, the stock market doing good and unemployment
And GDP.
numbers.
Yeah.
You're right, and GDP,
Yeah.
and the reality that costs have skyrocketed to the point where they can't keep pace. Your wages can't keep pace with your expenses. And so, I mean, he talks a lot on one or two videos on YouTube. I mean, he sat down with Elizabeth Warren and they discussed, the dynamics between that. And I just think the more data that comes in, and really the more that narrative gets out there, and it will, because especially as this crisis increasingly affects younger generations, I can't see how hopefully, even though we're not really, we talked with David about the role of data and experts and how it really isn't breaking through like it used to in the past, but if it does, and even Phil's mentioned in the group that maybe it doesn't even have to break through the media, because at a certain point, enough people will be affected by what's going on to where, people are open to that type of thing. I think it may just be our unique spot in history that we're going to fall in with the rest of the first world nations. We'll just be the last to do it, in my opinion.
Well, I think that when we talk about like being okay with socialism, because I think we don't really know exactly what it is. But one of the things I've noticed just throughout history, studying history, it looks like you don't have a whole lot of choice of what system you have. Like the system you have exists because of a set of conditions. And I think that when we say like, yeah, I'm okay with socialism, or, even the more extremes, I'd like to try out anarchism. It's a statement that we are disenfranchised with this system and we're willing to try other options. Because one of the things I've noticed about older generations, they do not want things to change. When 2008 happened, what did they do? They were like, rack them up, we're going to play again. That was their mentality, was like, yeah, when this happens, you just do the same thing over again. And it's like, wait a minute, isn't that stupid?
Well, and like you said,
it's what it is.
The thing is, they grew up and it was successful.
Yeah.
So so of course you fall back on what you know. So it's not crazy for them to do that, given that it's worked for them. But for everyone else who it hasn't worked for, that's when you get into this sort of narrative fight.
Because they go like, why can't millennials afford a new house? It's not because of our avocado toast.
Oh, goodness.
For all these other things.
We're getting blamed for everything. Dying. Like napkins.
Yeah.
Really like, okay, well, really?
Oh, yeah. There was a joke about paper straws opposed to the plastic straws, and just how.
Just let it all die. Isn't that capitalism?
That was a big.
Yeah, that's kind of the irony, is that boomers are like all about some capitalism and some let it all die until it's Hostess snacks.
Yeah.
I hadn't had a Twinkie in 10 years. I love Twinkies.
Yeah.
But they can die.
Right. Tommy, you were going to have a point.
Yeah, no, I was just going to say, when Darius was mentioning about experts breaking through, I couldn't help but think there's a book recently by Tom Nichols called The Death of Expertise. And I know that, like, this is, people have been complaining about anti-intellectualism in America for decades. There was Anti-Intellectualism in America, the book, in the 1960s. There was, Asimov in the 80s. So I'm like, I know that, and obviously, forever people have been complaining about anti-intellectualism and societies across the world. But it's hard. I guess I wonder how it compares to now, because especially in the day of the internet and social media, where everybody's an expert on everything now. I wonder if it's possible that experts are able to break through in this environment. And I would be curious. I'm sure that there's polling data on this that I haven't looked at yet, but I am curious to see how millennials compare to other generations with regard to does the concept of expertise even exist? And I'm like, obviously people will say, well, experts aren't always right, and it's like, yes, they're not always right, but it's like, what's your track record on predicting the future? Like, how does an expert's predictions compare to the average person's predictions? Is there, like, if they really aren't any better at it, then obviously it is worthless. But if they aren't, then it's like maybe they have something worth considering to offer. I'm really curious to see how if this is just a new normal.
To your point, when everybody was blasting all the college spring breakers for going to the beach during the Corona pandemic, a lot of times the articles blamed millennials for being the ones going out to the beach, and I'm like, no, they're Gen Z. It's the next group, because millennials, like I said, are now in their 30s, approaching 40, late 20s.
We just lost our jobs, so we're not partying anymore.
Yeah. and I'm bringing that point. The point is, at least in my site, on my Facebook wall, it seemed like millennials were the ones quoting from the experts the most, and honoring the quarantine regulation. So
I guess I think that might be a good point too, is hopefully, and I think maybe I've seen a study on this, but please don't quote me, because I might be sharing fake information, but I think that I read somewhere that younger generations are better at discerning fake information from so maybe hopefully that's, and I was going to say too, I know everybody's been beating up on Generation Z for that beach stuff, but I just have to say, I mean, like, these were a few people,
right.
I'm like, so I don't want to make sweeping generalizations.
I don't even think that was generational.
And if millennials, if it had been millennials going to college at that time,
right,
it would have been a handful of millennials out there too, and it wouldn't have been necessarily representative of the whole generation, but it would have been, that college demographic that you're always going to have a handful of people who are like, I'm invincible. There's nothing that could take me down.
Right.
I don't think I would have gone if I was 19 or 20.
I'm like, you wouldn't have, but this. I would
just
imagine
thinking, like,
a
in our college
percentage of
in our college
millennials
minds
would have done it as a percentage of Generation Z people that did it.
Yeah.
And the other thing, to your point, Tommy, about expertise, I think that the reason that there's been a breakdown in trust on expertise is because we have, in our society now, we have a very complex, intertwined system of interests. And when you have any given expert, right, they talk, and you're like, what you're going through is, does this align in my interests at all? Because you can get anybody up there to be an expert, and you can get two experts and they'll disagree because they have two different sets of interests. And I think that what you're seeing with the rise of populism is that people are stepping out on all sides of the fence, and they're saying, hey, wait a minute, what about my interests? Because at the end of the day, that's all that really matters to me.
Yeah.
And that's where I think expertise in this area is falling flat. It's not so much that they're necessarily wrong. It's that in order to be an expert in one thing, you have to ignore a whole lot of other things.
Yeah. On that point, I kind of want to end with a funny story there, because a of course, I worked in the Maryland state legislature, so I got to see a lot of very funny hearings for testimony. And on that point about experts, there was a hearing where it was for legislation for like turf fields, and how we were working with a doctor who, of course, had researched that on turf fields, like if you're running on them, the chemicals, all the chemicals that go into making the turf, it creates sort of like this cloud around you where if you breathe it in, they have some pretty consistent research that in the long term that could, be negative to your health. Well, in the same breath, our opposition was from the rubber industry. And they had their science.
They're experts,
yeah, they're expert.
Rubber's great.
Yep, and telling us, what percentage of it was rubber versus timber and all this other stuff. And it just sort of puts in mind to me that whole argument of you can have two experts, bring their research, disagreeing on something, and it's hard for the public, especially, just talking about, again, the Bush administration, the entire sort of upper echelons of their foreign policy staff. We trusted them because they had gotten us through the Gulf War, which was the first successful, military conflict we had since World War II. And so, the experts are there. We're not real confident in, say, the guy we picked as president to do it alone, but the people around him with their expertise are going to steer him in the right direction. So even if he gets into trouble, they have experience.
I just really, I know it sounded like you wanted to wrap up, but just really quickly, I just wanted to clarify that so that in case anybody watches this and mistakes what I'm trying to say. I certainly don't conflate politicians with experts. And I know, I feel like a lot of people do. A lot of people are like, why would you ever trust expertise? Look how dumb our politicians are. And it's like, that's because our politicians aren't experts. Like they do not, a lot of them are not well versed in the topics that they're discussing. And like you hear I've heard stories from staffers on Capitol Hill about how they just get as they're walking into a briefing, a lobbyist will hand them a list of talking points, and like that's how they get their information on the topic. Confusing politicians with experts and saying, well, politicians don't know anything. It's like, yes, they don't, and it's like, but that's distinguishable from expertise. And also, one thing I feel, I don't know if it's just my perception, but I feel like a lot of people think that it was the intelligence community that was responsible for misleading us into going into the Iraq war. But the intelligence community's actual reports that have been declassified were more nuanced than what the Bush administration was feeding the public. And that goes back again into like the discrepancy between the difference between expertise and politicians, because Donald Rumsfeld and Cheney and I'm like, according to Colin Powell, even he was being misled by them about what the intelligence was. And so I'm like, I know that like so many people like, why would you ever trust the intelligence community after what they did with with the Iraq war? And it's like, did you actually read what they wrote? Because that's not that it was mischaracterized what they were saying by politicians that you elected. And I just want to stand up for a little bit to defend the intelligence community on that aspect.
Well, actually, I've noticed one of the things I've noticed because people are surprisingly listening to the CDC a lot more. Right. One of the things that's bothered me through all of this is that you say that something is droplet, that it's spread by droplets and that therefore it's not airborne. Those are technical definitions, and that's kind of part of the problem with deferring to expertise, is because the experts understand what they mean when they say droplets and airborne. you know, and they understand that droplets aerosolize into the air. And even though it's not airborne in the functional sense, that there is what we would colloquially consider to be airborne contact.
Right.
You know, it's those kind of technical distinctions that make it hard for experts to communicate with laymen, to the point where, like, I mean, there are like you go into court trials and there are trial experts on wood grain. Think about your life and think about how much time you would have to devote to looking at wood to become an expert on wood grain, but those people exist. You know, and they're hard to talk to because so much of their life is just wrapped up into staring at wood grain.
I mean, I take your point, and I think that there is that element of experts not always being the most effective communicators. Well, I also feel like a lot of times too, it's just a matter of what people want to believe in. And if an expert is saying something that they don't want to believe, then that means that they don't know what they're talking about. And if an expert does saying something that they want to believe, then well, that just, you know, they know what they're talking about. And I think that's, you know, might be part of the issue too, as well.
It seems like we're definitely acknowledging the world that our generation came of age in, all the problems of that world. We're acknowledging the leadership style that we are for and that we're against. I think this is only the beginning of more conversations. I wouldn't mind getting together again to talk about what is the type of world that we want to bring in and lead. What is the type of world that we want to build for our kids? So I definitely want that to be the next time discussion.
All right.
Thank you guys. It was fun.
Cool.
Bye-bye, Catherine, wherever you are.
Guys.